G'day, I'm Garry Stevens, and welcome to the second series of the History in the Bible podcast. More of the history in more of the books in all the Bibles. Episode 2.24, Battle for the New Testament, Part 4, Modern Times. In the last episode of the History in the Bible, I recounted the story of the Reformation battle for a critical, reliable edition of the Greek New Testament. By the time the King James Bible was written, the New Testament circulated in two versions. Catholics used the Vulgate, a Latin translation made by St. Jerome towards the end of the Roman Empire. In a frenetic display of scholarship, Protestants had gone back to old Byzantine manuscripts to produce what we now call the Greek Textus Receptus. Even that existed in several flavours. The Textus Receptus was used to produce new vernacular translations of the New Testament, amongst them the King James Bible. One of the pioneers of the Textus Receptus was Theodore de Beza, the Protestant reformer who succeeded John Calvin in Switzerland. In France, he discovered two interesting codices, books, of some of the New Testament. One he found in the town of Clermont in Picardy. The other he simply stole from the monastic library at Lyon. Both were polyglots, Greek and Latin, on facing pages. One codex contained incomplete versions of the Gospels and Acts. The other contained Paul's letters and some books that never made it into our New Testament: the Epistle to Barnabas, the Shepherd of Hermas, the Acts of Paul, and the Revelation of Peter. It also declared that Revelation and the book of Acts were fake. Beza didn't know what to make of the codices. Those extra books were certainly a worry, and the texts were strikingly different to all the other Greek manuscripts he had. Beza decided they were weird aberrations. He ignored them when he made his own edition of the Textus Receptus. He was not to know that those codices were written just after the fall of the Western Roman Empire and were much, much older than any of his other manuscripts. After Beza pish-tished his own finds, other codices appeared. The first was the Codex Alexandrinus, so named after Cyril Lucarius, Patriarch of Alexandria. He ended up as Cyril I, Ecumenical Patriarch of Constantinople in the 1620s. It's amazing he got that far. Cyril was always embroiled in trouble. Cyril was deeply learned and widely travelled. He was a fan of Europe's Protestant reforms. Cyril was deposed and banished several times. His flock disputed his orthodox credentials. The Spanish and French ambassadors to the Turkish court pressured the Sultan to get him out of the picture. They found the prospect of some sort of Calvinized Orthodox Christianity horrifying. The English and Dutch ambassadors supported the hapless Cyril. The troublesome patriarch was strangled by the Turkish government for being a general annoyance. Before his demise, he donated the Codex Alexandrinus to King Charles I of England, in gratitude for English support. A century after that happy gift, in the early 1700s, Swiss and German scholars began comparing Alexandrinus against the Textus Receptus. No one at the time knew that Alexandrinus was of the same antiquity as the codices that Beza had dismissed. The scholars did know that Alexandrinus differed in many places from the Textus Receptus, especially in the books other than the Gospels. Were these differences trivial or significant? No one knew. At that point, textual criticism of the New Testament stalled. The Textus Receptus and Vulgate were friendly rivals, and the Codex Alexandrinus a bothersome curio. Two discoveries in the mid-19th century moved New Testament studies to a whole new level. These were the discoveries of the Codex Sinaiticus and the Codex Vaticanus. The two codices were compiled in the late Roman Empire, not long after the rule of Constantine. They are the most important ancient editions of the New Testament in existence. They are the foundation of all modern New Testament scholarship. We owe the publication of both of these to the German scholar and adventurer Constantine von Tischendorf, who buccaneered in the 1840s. Nowadays he is only known to erudite biblical scholars. He deserves better than that. Every single modern English translation of the New Testament, Catholic or Protestant, liberal or evangelical, has roots in his work. You can hear more about him in episode 2.17, Recovering the Bible, A Century of Revelations. At St. Catherine's Monastery on Mount Sinai, Tischendorf found a parchment Bible. Tischendorf said that the monks gave it to him as a gift over his 15 visits to the monastery. The monks said they lent it to him. Litigation continues to this day. I believe the monks. Today the book is known as Codex Sinaiticus. Sinaiticus is regarded as one of the great treasures of humankind. Until the 1930s, the precious manuscript was housed in the Russian National Library. Joseph Stalin decided that he would prefer money and sold most of it to the British Museum. Sinaiticus contains half of the Septuagint, the Greek translation of the Old Testament made in Hellenistic times. It includes a complete Greek version of the New Testament. As Tischendorf suspected, and modern research has supported, this Bible dates from about 350, in the earliest decades of the Christian Roman Empire. There is a possibility Sinaiticus was commissioned by the Emperor Constantine himself. Sinaiticus was centuries older than any manuscript used by the scholars who assembled the Textus Receptus. Sinaiticus is not an imposing book, but it is immaculately constructed. The binding alone must have been at the forefront of late Roman technology. You could easily fit the work into a duffel bag. The book is about 38 centimetres high by 35 centimetres wide, say 15 by 13 inches. Each page consists of 4 columns of Greek. Apart from the usual books of the New Testament, Sinaiticus includes the Shepherd of Hermas and the Epistle of Barnabas. Tischendorf did not live to see the complete publication of Sinaiticus to the world. That project took 60 languid years to complete, only ending after the First World War. Tischendorf must have been enraged by the slow publication of Sinaiticus. Just to show the world's biblical scholars he was at the top of his game, and that they were all dimwits, Tischendorf unearthed a second codex of earth-shaking importance, the Codex Vaticanus. Vaticanus is now recognised as contemporary with Sinaiticus and of equal import. Tischendorf was able to publish Vaticanus many decades before the other duffers got around to Sinaiticus. Tischendorf did not find the Codex Vaticanus in some obscure monastery. He uncovered the Codex in the very heart of Christendom, the Vatican Library. The Codex had been there forever. The book is recorded in the library's earliest catalogue, issued in 1475. That was 50 years before European scholars began work on the great project of the Textus Receptus. The librarians were in no hurry to inform the world of their pearl. They let slip a few hints in letters to Erasmus. Over the next few hundred years, they guardedly let a few scholars take a peek or two at the Codex. The cat was let out of the bag after the French Emperor Napoleon purloined Vaticanus and transported the Codex to Paris. Various scholars published portions. The Vatican librarians retrieved the precious text and spent the rest of their lives obstructing examination. Why on earth would Catholic clergy want to conceal things? It's a mystery. Codex Vaticanus is even smaller than Sinaiticus, only 27 by 27 centimetres, 11 by 11 inches. The Greek text is written continuously in small, neat writing, 3 columns to a page. Vaticanus omits the letters to Timothy and Titus, Philemon, the book of Revelation, and most of the letters to the Hebrews. The last decades of the 19th century were a brain-spinning time for biblical archaeologists and scholars. Amateur unearthers were stumbling across ancient manuscripts all over the Middle East. Today we have over 5,000 manuscript portions of the New Testament, ranging from mighty works such as Vaticanus and Sinaiticus, tiny scraps. Let me put that into proportion. We have 350 manuscripts of the plays of Euripides, and one single manuscript preserving the first 6 books of the Annals of the Roman historian Tacitus. We have no manuscripts of the works of the earliest church fathers, whose words are preserved only as quotations in later authors. Tischendorf's publication of Vaticanus struck the world's biblical scholars as a lightning bolt. Here was an unquestionably ancient document whose content differed significantly from the Textus Receptus. The tenured and bewhiskered professors sprang into action after a few well-deserved sherries and watercress sandwiches. Combing through all the manuscripts they now had, the academics discerned 3 distinct families of documents: the Byzantine, Alexandrian, and Western. This division is still a cornerstone of contemporary scholarship. Let's explore these very different textual traditions. The Byzantine tradition of manuscripts were produced in the, wait for it, Byzantine Empire. Almost all the New Testament manuscripts we have, 85% or more, are in the Byzantine tradition. Manuscripts copied in the empire from the early Middle Ages to the fall of Constantinople. Speculation is that the tradition arose in the important city of Antioch in Syria. All the manuscripts used for the Textus Receptus were from the Byzantine tradition. Compared to the other traditions, Byzantine manuscripts are written in slicker Greek. They smooth out difficulties and inconsistencies. Here is a classic example from the first chapter of Mark. The Byzantine tradition has this, quote, Mark 1:2. As it is written in the prophets, behold, I send my messenger before thy face, which shall prepare thy way before thee. The voice of one crying in the wilderness, prepare ye the way of the Lord, make his paths straight. End quote. Against this stands the Alexandrian manuscript tradition, powerfully represented by the codices Sinaiticus and Vaticanus. We believe this tradition originated in the intellectual powerhouse of Alexandria. The Alexandrian tradition has this, quote, Mark 1:2. As it is written in the prophet Isaiah, see, I am sending my messenger ahead of you, who will prepare your way. The voice of one crying out in the wilderness, prepare the way of the Lord. End quote. In the Alexandrian writings, the Gospel of Mark has got it wrong. The passage Mark quotes is not from Isaiah, but from Malachi. The Alexandrian version keeps the mistake. The Byzantine version eliminates it. Another example. Following the Textus Receptus and the Byzantine tradition, the King James Bible has this for the Lord's Prayer from the Gospel of Matthew. Quote, Matthew 6:9b. Our Father in heaven, hallowed be your name. Your kingdom come. Your will be done on earth as it is in heaven. Give us this day our daily bread, and forgive us our debts, as we have also forgiven our debtors. And do not bring us to the time of trial, but rescue us from the evil one. For thine is the kingdom, and the power, and the glory, for ever. Amen." End quote. That last half verse is called the doxology to the Lord's Prayer. For thine is the kingdom, and the power, and the glory, for ever. Amen. That is not in the Gospel of Luke's version of the prayer, nor is it in any manuscript of Matthew in the Alexandrian tradition. It is not in the Latin Vulgate. The doxology has never been used by Catholics. Today, the doxology is absent from modern English translations. I'll finish with the least represented textual tradition, the Western. That's a bit of a misnomer, since we find manuscripts of that style in the East. But what the hey? Almost all the Western-style manuscripts are polyglots, with the text in both Latin and Greek. We really have no idea where they came from. Not only do they differ significantly from the Byzantine tradition, but also from St. Jerome's later Latin Vulgate. Most professors think that the Western tradition manuscripts represent the mishmash of old Latin works that Jerome was hired to clean up. I mentioned in the last episode that Theodore de Beza, the Protestant reformer who succeeded John Calvin, had stumbled on 2 large codices of the New Testament, but he could not make head nor tail of them. They were nothing like his other Greek manuscripts. We now know that his codices were Western tradition books. He was quite right to ignore them. The Western tradition is just off the scale. Western tradition manuscripts uniquely list the Gospels in the order Matthew, John, Luke and Mark. Words and clauses are changed, omitted and inserted whenever it seemed that the meaning could be made more forcefully. The editors harmonised and threw in their own ideas from books that never made it into the canon. They had their own ideas and were never afraid to drop them into the pot. Let's take an example from Acts. Paul and his buddy Barnabas are preaching in Syria. Out of the blue, they are confronted by messengers from Judea. Here is the text we use today, quote, Acts 15:1. Then certain individuals came down from Judea and were teaching the brothers, "Unless you are circumcised according to the custom of Moses, you cannot be saved." And after Paul and Barnabas had no small dissension and debate with them, Paul and Barnabas and some of the others were appointed to go up to Jerusalem to discuss this question with the apostles and the elders. End quote. The Western text adds much more material. Quote, Acts 15:1 in the Western text tradition. Then certain individuals came down from Judea and were teaching the brothers, "Unless you are circumcised according to the custom of Moses and walk with him, you cannot be saved." And after Paul and Barnabas had no small dissension and debate with them, for Paul replied, strongly insisting that they should remain as they had been when they first believed. But those who had come from Jerusalem assigned Paul and Barnabas and some of the others of their number to go up to Jerusalem to discuss this question with the apostles and the elders for their judgment. End quote. By the last decades of the 19th century, scholars were swimming in manuscripts from different traditions. New manuscripts were popping up all the time. Professors faced exactly the same problem that St. Jerome had tackled in the Roman Empire. The same problem that the compilers of the Textus Receptus had struggled with during the Reformation. Of all these manuscripts, which were closest to the intentions of the writers of the New Testament? They knew they were chasing a phantom, but they gave it their best shot. As with all their predecessors, they had to make decisions, large and small, at every turn. Our old friend Tischendorf was the first to compile a critical text. Tischendorf was a chronic overachiever. But even his efforts were surpassed by a 30-year collaboration between Brooke Foss Westcott, the English Bishop of Durham, and the Irish theologian Fenton John Anthony Hort. Really, can you think of any names more Victorian? They brought to their task the one essential tool required of all Victorian scholars: truly impressive facial hair. Hort and Westcott began the second and final phase of the battle to establish the text of the New Testament after the work of Erasmus and his successors. No, let me correct that. If we allow St. Jerome as the first critical editor, they began the third and final phase. The two scholars died around 1900, just when Europeans were unearthing ancient New Testament texts in every backyard in Egypt. Their work was carried on by two German scholars, Eberhard Nestler and his son. Over another 30 years, they produced many editions of their Greek New Testament, each edition incorporating a more sophisticated academic commentary. In the 1950s, Kurt Arland, a respected German theologian, was brought on board with instructions to incorporate all the latest manuscript finds. When Nestler began his work, he knew of fewer than a dozen ancient papyri of the New Testament. Now we have almost 150. Quite a lot of these were found in a rubbish tip at Oxyrhynchus in the early decades of the 20th century. In Roman times, Oxyrhynchus was the third largest city in Egypt. Many of these papyri are fragments just the size of a credit card. A very few contain large chunks of the New Testament books. These papyri are considered to be the earliest witnesses to the original text of the New Testament, if you can think of an original. 3 vie for the honour of the very oldest. The smallest but probably oldest papyrus is labelled with the boring name of P52. It is about the size of an index card, 9 by 6 centimetres, or 4 by 3 inches. This contains but 5 verses from the Gospel of John. A papyrus labelled P66 contains most of the Gospel of John. It is a book of 75 pages, each a modest 15 by 15 centimetres, about 6 by 6 inches. This papyrus looks like a draft. It's full of crossing outs. The text is typical of the Alexandrian textual tradition. The third papyrus is P46, another whopper, at 86 rather larger pages, 28 by 16 centimetres, 11 by 6 inches. P46 is our oldest copy of the letters of Paul. Again, it stands in the Alexandrian textual tradition. Not that the papyrus contains all the letters. The pastoral letters, as so often, Timothy and Titus, are conspicuously absent. These 3 papyri are dated from 100 to 200 AD. No other New Testament manuscript comes even close to that antiquity. How do we know when they were written? Radiocarbon dating, right? For this time period, radiocarbon dating can locate a papyrus to plus or minus 50 years, with a confidence of about 7%. That's one standard deviation for you statistics buffs. A laboratory might say, we think this papyrus dates to 150 AD, with a 70% chance that it dates to 100 to 200 AD. So that's how it's done, radiocarbon dating. No. After they popped into the dodgy antiquities marketplaces of the Middle East in the first half of the 20th century, the important papyri was snapped up by wealthy libraries and universities. Most of these institutions have a straightforward policy. No part of any papyrus can be destroyed for any purpose. Not one single skerrick. So much for radiocarbon dating. If not by radiocarbon, how are these most important of papyri dated? by the analysis of handwriting, the science of paleography. That tool had been in the scholarly toolkit since the 1930s. Handwriting styles change through the centuries. The handwriting of Benjamin Franklin in 1750 bears little resemblance to the handwriting of a century later. In 1850, most educated people wrote in an elegant copperplate. Very few did that in 1950. Most ancient New Testament manuscripts are dated not by carbon dating, but by the analysis of handwriting. There are plenty of scholars who think that paleography is absolute rubbish. They are a minority, but a feisty minority. We do have a good deal of evidence to support the paleographers. Experiments comparing radiocarbon dating of papyrus scraps to handwriting analysis of those same scraps shows they are of one accord. Paleography, it would seem, can hold its head high. The formal name of the critical Greek edition of Nestler and Arland is the Novum Testamentum Graeci. Everyone just calls it Nestler-Arland. This majestic work is now in its 28th edition. Nestler-Arland is the Greek text used by every single English translation of the New Testament made since the King James Bible. The Revised Version, the Revised Standard Version, the New Revised Standard Version, the American Standard Version, the New International Version, the New Living Translation, the English Standard Version, the New American Bible, the New World Translation of the Jehovah's Witnesses. Nestler-Arland relies almost entirely on the Alexandrian tradition of manuscripts, especially the mighty codices Sinaiticus and Vaticanus. But it also includes insights from the Codex Alexandrinus that King Charles I was given, and the two codices that so puzzled Theodore Beza during the Reformation. Nestler-Arland pretty much ignores the Byzantine tradition, the manuscripts used by the King James Bible. Why? After all, the Byzantine tradition manuscripts are by far the most numerous. But all these manuscripts were written very late, after the time of Charlemagne, at the end of the so-called Dark Ages, after 900. We only have a tiny 6 manuscripts written before that time conforming to the Byzantine tradition. All the earlier Greek manuscripts we have stand in the Alexandrian tradition. Nestler-Arland takes the position that in general, the earlier the manuscript, the more reliable. In this podcast, I follow Nestler-Arland and the English language Bibles derived from it. There are 2 holdouts against that position, one large and one small. The Orthodox churches regard the Byzantine family of manuscripts as the go-to books for the real Word of God. In the early 1900s, at the same time as Western scholars moved to create a critical text based on the Alexandrian tradition, the Greek Orthodox Patriarch of Constantinople laboured to produce a critical edition derived from the Byzantine manuscripts. The Orthodox reject the principle that older means better, and they are perfectly entitled to do so. Let me give you one example of how every version of the New Testament is the result of complex editorial decisions. Even the Patriarch of Constantinople had to make decisions. In the last episode, I mentioned the first letter of John, chapter 5, and the famous Johannine comma or clause. In all Byzantine manuscripts, the verse reads, quote, "There are 3 that testify, the Spirit and the water and the blood, and these 3 agree." End quote. Latin manuscripts have this, quote, 1 John 5:7, "And there are 3 who give testimony in heaven, the Father, the Word, and the Holy Ghost. And these 3 are one. And there are 3 that give testimony on earth, the Spirit, and the water, and the blood. And these 3 are one." End quote. Byzantine manuscripts do not name the three, nor say they are one. The Reformation scholar Erasmus was so upset by that omission that he tossed it into his later editions, and so it passed down to the King James Bible. Following Nestler Arland, all modern English language Bibles omit it, on the grounds that the comma is a later Latin addition. The Johannine comma was not found in any of the manuscripts used by the Orthodox sages to assemble the patriarchal text. A convocation of Orthodox bishops scratched their heads, decided to bend their principles a letter, and inserted the comma into the patriarchal text anyway. The second and lesser holdout is strictly an English language problem. A shrinking number of English language speakers hold that the King James version of the Bible is the one true Bible. They point to the scholars assembled by King James I. Those professors were indeed the largest and smartest team assembled to work on a translation of the Bible since a Jewish syndicate had translated the Hebrew Old Testament into the Greek Septuagint during Hellenistic times. But does that make the King James Bible the one true English Bible? At the far left of the spectrum, a vocal group hold that the King James Bible is divinely sanctioned, the hand of God acting through a conclave of crusty 17th century clerics. They believe the King James Bible is inerrant and infallible. There's no answer to that. According to these people, the clerics assembled by James I somehow discerned the will of God. The squad corralled by James used the editions of Theodore de Beza, of Erasmus, and the Complutensian polyglot. According to the King James only boosters, whenever one learned cleric mulled over whether to use a verse from Beza or Erasmus, God tapped him on the shoulder and said, "Use Erasmus. Next time use Beza." A little to the right of that position, some hold that the Byzantine family of manuscripts that were the basis of the Greek Textus Receptus underlying the King James Bible are superior to the Alexandrian tradition of modern translations. Now, that's what the modern Greek Orthodox believe, right? No. The Byzantine manuscripts used by the Textus Receptus are poor representatives of the Byzantine tradition. The patriarchal text used by modern Orthodox uses a vastly superior collection of manuscripts compared to those used by the Textus Receptus and the King James Bible. In the next episode, I begin my quest for the historical Jesus. See you then. Thanks for listening. For maps, charts, and diagrams, check out my website, www.historyinthebible.com.